Hello, and welcome to The Mastering Show. My name is Ian Shepherd. I'm a mastering engineer, and I run the production advice website aimed at helping you get the best results recording, mixing, and mastering your music. We have something a little bit different this episode. I recently interviewed Nick Rives from Capitol Studios about his work mixing the Atmos version of the new Billie Eilish album, Happier Than Ever. And that Atmos mix actually won the Dynamic Range Day Award 2022. I was able to include some of that interview in the webcast for the event, but we were able to talk for longer, and a few people have asked if they could hear the whole interview, so I thought it would make sense to release it as a podcast episode. So, without further ado, here it is. I hope you enjoy it. Nick, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
And of course, the reason you're here is that you mixed the Atmos version of the new Billie Eilish album, Happier Than Ever, I guess about a year ago, was it now? Is it longer?
Yeah, it's about a year ago now. Yeah, that's about right.
It is nominated for this year's Dynamic Range Day Award. We've got a few Atmos albums in the lineup this year because they have great dynamics, which is what
Absolutely.
Today is all about. And I mean, I'm not going to beat about the bush. I'm delighted to say that this album you have won. So congratulations.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. That's awesome.
No, my pleasure. I mean, you know, it was kind of, well, I love the album musically.
Totally.
I particularly love the Atmos version of it because I think the immersive format suits the album so well. You know, it just seems like a kind of perfect fit to me in terms of, you know, the kind of moody, atmospheric, you know, it benefits as far as I'm concerned from having that extra space and that room to breathe. It must have been great to work on, really good fun.
It was a ton of fun. I mean, I would put it on the short list of the most engaging and satisfying projects that I've ever worked on. For all of the reasons that you mentioned, you know, it's the music is just so perfect. The composition and the layout and the detailing and the performances is just it's like tailor-made for the format. And so it was just really a lot of fun for me to just stretch out into the space. I make all my decisions based on the composition. So it made everything just felt smooth and natural. And the next thing I knew, I felt like I had this really great experience. So I'm very proud of the work.
No, it's fantastic. And I'd like to get into asking you a few questions about kind of how you work when you're working in Atmos and specifically how the dynamics of the format kind of influence the way that you do things. But maybe first, just kind of for people who may not know you, so you work at Capitol Studios in LA. How were you always kind of interested in immersive audio and in surround? Was that your mission kind of from the get-go? Is that something you kind of grew into? How did it work?
Actually, it was a very circumstantial thing. I've been working at Capitol for years, and I'm a staff engineer. And so, you know, as comes with that type of job, I just get kind of thrown at a wide range of different challenges, you know, whether I'm recording a band or mixing a band, recording for TV and film, live shows, any of that, right? So I pride myself on the diversity of the role. What ended up happening was Dolby was exploring the opportunities for Atmos to kind of, you know, bringing Atmos to the music community rather than the television and film side of things where it was, you know, created and born. So a product of those conversations was that our Capitol Studio C was built out into an Atmos mixing space. The idea being that it is a purpose-built for music Atmos mixing room, which at the time didn't really exist, right? So this is like 2017, and the only Atmos mixing rooms that were happening were kind of dub stage style. So they were very like movie theater designs, like, you know, like most dub stage. So huge rooms, speakers are way up high, tons of speakers very far away from you. And we're like, okay, well, like, how can we build this in a, you know, record studio style format? And what we kind of casually referred to as a near field build. And so, you know, the idea being that, you know, the LCR, the sides and the surrounds are all at ear height and are relatively, you know, not close, but, you know, certainly not a theater, you know, recording studio sized room with the height channels, you know, kind of brought in and directly overhead so that we're basically really kind of approaching it like kind of a traditional recording studio might, you know, at least that was our, as a traditional recording studio, that was our interpretation. And that was that was kind of the beginning of the adventure, So Art Kelm built that room, or turned C into a compatible room, and I was kind of given the opportunity to explore with no real rules or regulations or restrictions, which ended up being a wonderful and enormous opportunity for me. So, but it kind of was circumstantial. I was sort of the younger guy on the team, and therefore had the least to lose by burning the hours doing experimenting with the new tech, and there was definitely a period of time where it was like, oh, there goes Nick, he's going to mix on those 20 speakers again. Let's see what that, you know what I mean? And it was like, there were no rules. There was no commercial outlet for it yet. So I wasn't held to any standards whatsoever. And it was just an absolute ton of fun, and it continues to be. But over the years since then, we have, of course, in collaboration with Dolby and UMG, we've developed these sort of best practices. We've seen the way it has come out, at least, these early days of it existing as a consumer format and what it looks like on the back end. And so it's been this long and really wonderful journey for me. But it was something that kind of happened sort of circumstantially. And I absolutely love every opportunity that has come from that.
Yeah, it's so great when you get, I mean, I did a lot of 5.1 mixing back in the day, and I kind of got into it in the same kind of way. It was, it was the room that I was working out of that they wanted to do the install in, and, the opportunity was there, and I just said, yeah, I'll give that a go. And yeah, same thing. Just loved working in it. So like you say, by now you've kind of got, I imagine, a fairly well-baked process for dealing with this stuff. Because I know that, with the kind of explosion of interest in the format, there's been a huge demand for existing albums to be revisited, I guess, and optimized for listening in Atmos. So maybe you could kind of just talk us through what that process looks for you, kind of particularly in relation to Billy's album. Because other people I've talked to, that you get given stems, and then they take the stereo master, and that's their reference. So kind of step one for them is to match that original mix on master as closely as possible, and then expand it out into the spatial space. Is that the same for you, or do you kind of start from scratch and just build it up as it kind of as you see it? How does it work?
Yes and yes. The vast majority of the time, including the Billy records and very much the overwhelming majority of the mixes that I create are based on stereo mix stems. There have been some circumstances where we've gone back to multi-tracks, and that offers some fun exploration as well. But I think the primary kind of purpose for that methodology is that as the climate as it exists today is that records are composed and created in stereo, and that Atmos is while only very recently has started to become a factor in considerations for composition. By and large, the majority of these records are designed and mixed in stereo. And so my task, of course, is to kind of walk this interesting line between staying true to everything about the stereo that is either known and loved or was labored over intensely by the artists and the team. So staying true to that identity while also creating something compelling and different that is the Atmos experience, right? And that's kind of a fun and a sometimes challenging thing to navigate, especially it just varies from every project to every project. Pop stuff, it's different from hip hop, different than rock and roll, punk, EDM, classical, jazz. I've had the luxury of exploring all of these genres. The outcome is always dependent on the nature of what's going on in the composition. But to get to your point, I take, so I get the stereo master and I have that as my reference, and I just park it in the LR, and, I will always have the opportunity to bounce between my Atmos mix and the stereo reference, which I do constantly and for everything I work on, right? I need to make sure that I'm not deviating from all of these decisions that were labored over intensely by the people who put together the stereo, and every project is different in terms of my relationship to either the artist or the mixer or the producer or the label. So by, anchoring myself in this perspective of the stereo is my gospel, and everything I'm going to create is going to be based on that identity, but take advantage of the tool set that I have, the experience that I'm able to create that doesn't exist in stereo. And so what that naturally leads to is my process, which is that every decision I make in terms of panning, and the experience from the listening position, both in speakers and headphones, is dependent on the composition. The composition tells me what to do. So I would never make a statement like, the piano goes in the rear, or the shaker goes on the left. You know what I mean? It's like it's which I know is a radical oversimplification, but it's really like dissecting what it is, why these different instruments or sound elements or vocal elements exist in their part in the song. What role do they play in the composition from like a, kind of a formal, almost score oriented perspective? And then how can I capitalize on those compositional decisions to yield an experience that feels both natural, but also exciting and kinetic, right? So, a very common production element in contemporary music is the idea of like risers and stingers, right? That some element is going to bring us across the bar line from the verse to the chorus. And so I can use, my space and my tool set to accentuate those decisions, like have something sweep from the rear to the front and then move back overhead or something like that. You know what I mean? The idea that like in verse 2, there's this like mellotron pad, whereas verse 1 was more stark and intimate. It's like, okay, that's a new element, and its purpose is to bring us compositionally forward, right? We're moving forward in the song. We haven't gone all the way back to verse 1. We're now in verse 2. It's got a different energy. So perhaps I can bring that mellotron pad to somewhere in the space that we haven't really had energy before, or in verse 1 is relatively quiet, to really underscore the compositional decisions that are being made and expand upon them with the dimensions that Atmos has to offer, So, and then also just think about storytelling, right? We have to assume in general that the audience is sitting, in approximately the correct space. And therefore, what is the story? What are the most important elements? And let those be anchors. If it's a backbeat driven track, like any kind of pop rock or R&B thing, vocal bass drums in the front. They're what's going to not change. They're what's going to be our grounding elements and our primary driving forces. And then all of our other compositional elements give us all of this harmonic, rhythmic, and contextual color, and can be brought around us in meaningful and compelling ways. But then as I'm exploring that journey, I'm flipping back and forth to the stereo to make sure that I haven't deviated radically from those decisions. Regardless of how cool I might think, what my decisions might be, it's not my job necessarily to expand upon what's been done, but to translate it into our space in a way that's meaningful and musical and gives meaning to the journey in particular, right? So that the listener, whether they're a diehard fan or just brand new to the experience, can explore what's different or meaningful about the stereo and the Atmos and see meaning in both experiences. I mean, I'll take records. Personally, if I'm sitting at home in my living room, nice cup of coffee or glass of wine, I love listening in Atmos. But if I'm running on the treadmill at the gym, I'll probably go to the stereo, just because for that application, it kind of yields a different, and more practical experience. And I think that's the beauty of what it is that we're doing now. It's not meant to replace. It's got different kinetics. It's got different dynamics. It's a different expression of what's ultimately the same story. And I think that they are able to coexist peacefully and complementary. And so I try to find my place in creating a mix that suits that need in a meaningful way.
Yeah, that's great. And you mentioned dynamics as one of the components there. And of course, that's the reason this album has won the award. We had a few Atmos albums included in the list here. So there was Future Nostalgia by Dua Lipa, Montero by Lil Nas X, Solar Power by Lorde, Sour by Olivia Rodrigo. Good. And nice. All of those, for me, when I move, I mean, even listening on earbuds, moving from the stereo into the Atmos, it's all still there, but it's more. And for me, the way that there's more is in the dynamics. Could talk just briefly about the kind of the technical aspects of that, because I know that Dolby strongly recommend, if not require, that the loudest songs should be -18 LUFS. And I know that Universal in particular have taken that to heart. And of course, that's a dramatic difference between stereo stuff, which could easily be -8 or louder. So you're talking 8 to 10 dBs extra headroom. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the reason for that is largely practical. If you have this virtual mix effectively in the Atmos format that can translate to 20 speakers, or even in the most humble situations kind of 10 or 12 speakers, and also translate down onto earbuds, in order just to have the processing flexibility to be able to combine all of those elements without causing problems, you need the extra headroom. Is that an accurate way of describing it?
Yes, that is the most practical way to approach that change in deliverable spec, right? Is that, you're creating a virtual mix that needs to conform itself to whatever shape it ends up, being rendered out of, whether that's headphones or a movie theater, right? If you're in a movie theater with 64 speakers, that can do a certain energy dispersion pattern, whereas headphones, it's going to be a radically different one, or a 5-1 system or a sound bar, right? Like I don't want to say limitations, but the constraints of any given playback system need to be adhered to, but we're only making the one mix. I'm only delivering the one file. So by creating that headroom, it allows us to better access the widest range of playback environments with the greatest level of consistency in terms of the way that energy is compiled, and freeing us of the constraints of like hitting a hard limiter or the possibility of distortion. I'm not the best expert on loudness, but I deal with it in a practical way every day. Right. So let's talk about that -18 LUFS integrated concept, right? Integrated LUFS is a very relative sense of loudness and energy. And what do I mean by that? A big band or an EDM track or like a Beck tune with 90 million, different instruments coming out of every, place in the room at -18 will yield one perceived loudness that might be different than a vocal and an acoustic guitar that also is at -18. That will be substantially louder perceived energy than the super dense, hyper busy track, and that's what's great about LUFS, but it's also what's challenging about LUFS sometimes, and so what we do is, we try and mix in album format as one does, right? So you've got 8, 10, 20 tracks. And as you go through that album, it's of course an ebb and flow of experiences. I mean, some albums are, 10 singles, and some albums have interludes and orchestral breakdowns. And, it's the wonderful diversity of music. So, it is our role to create an experience that has continuity from top to bottom. And therefore it's nice to have a guideline, like where LUFS should end up as a limiting point, not limiting as in dynamic range limiting, but like, okay, there's what we'll consider our loudest, place in this experience is going to be a track that integrated gives us -18 LUFS. And every other track on the record can kind of be balanced against that to create that continuum. And what I generally suggest and what I do personally is just bring down the other tracks to create that continuous experience. And sometimes that can be a challenge. Absolutely. And sometimes it can yield a fantastically theatrical result where, you've got these intimate verses and these intimate tracks, and then these bombastic, chaotic tracks that are full of energy and life. And that dynamic experience is thoroughly satisfying as the listener. We get that experience when we go to live shows. We get that experience when you're in a room with a band. It's the way it feels when you're playing in a band. And it's a wonderful way to experience music when you have the opportunity to. I'm very grateful for the opportunities that Atmos gives us to explore that dynamic range. 18 LUFS integrated still has plenty of opportunity for things to get loud and things to get quiet. We're talking about the Billy record. So the title track, Happier Than Ever, I think is a perfect example of this. The first 2/3 of that, that track's perfectly thirds. And, the first third is like very intimate and very, kind of, there's an atmosphere to it, but there's really this kind of intimate storytelling going on in that way that Billie Eilish is so incredibly good at, right? Her voice just brings you into this, like you feel like it's almost, you almost get nervous at how intimate you are. And then there's this middle third transition period where we start getting these like electric guitars show up. They kind of creep in and there's this nice effect. And then it brings us to this moment with these palm mutes. And it's like, okay, like musically, our energy is exciting. We've stepped up a level, and the vocal gets a little bit larger, a little bit more impactful. And then we hit this back third that is just absolutely pedal to the metal. It is just explosive, crunchy guitars, backbust distorted drums. Like the bass is just thunderous, and she's like screaming over the top of it, or through it, I should say. Kind of the absolute apex of the energy output in the entire record, and the narrative of the song is wildly emotional. So the stereo mix is awesome. and everything, the fidelity is incredible, and everything sounds, just really good and really locked into a perfect place, and it'll speak on any system. What I was able to explore is the opportunity for it to grow and really hit when it gets to that big moment, and it is like violent. And I think that that's a really fun opportunity to take advantage of what the Atmos format has to offer, what the -18 integrated LUFS deliverable standard has to offer, to really expand upon the expression of that performance and of that composition. Like, I want to feel like I'm at that stadium and my hair's being blown back. That visceral excitement is in large part due to the opportunity to explore dynamics. And I think that's a really fun and meaningful expression in all music. Atmos has given us an opportunity to kind of bring that back into what would be a more mainstream consumer experience. I mean, when I think about like this really great memory as a kid going and seeing Carmina Burana at the San Francisco Symphony, and the overture of that piece, So Fortuna, they just drop the hammer, bar one, beat one, literally, and it's just like explosive sound, and then all of a sudden we're getting real quiet and we're building up, and I mean, I know that's the hallmark of classical music, but that was just a memory that really landed with me. The power of an unamplified performance of 90 people on stage doing this whole thing, and just like feeling like I'm doing this in my chair and then I'm doing this in my chair, I mean, just really fun experience, and to now be able to bring that to the type of work that I do that's radically outside of that genre is enormously satisfying to me.
Yeah, no, I'll bet. And it's one of the things that's most satisfying for me about these Atmos mixes, because I mean, all of the examples that are on the shortlist this year, if you have an Apple device and want to toggle the spatial audio on and off, so in which case when you turn it, if you're streaming the files, if you switch spatial audio off, it will revert to the original stereo mix. And with sound check, the normalization enabled, there's not a huge difference in the loudness there. So you get a pretty good comparison of the two versions. And the vast majority of those are big, aggressive. I mean, the Dua Lipa album is seriously loud in stereo.
Big time.
But it still works in Atmos. Over and over people are telling me, oh no, you need the loudness to achieve the sound. And I've been saying, do we though? It's like, maybe it's harder to achieve that intensity and that pressure if you're not slamming it right up against the top of the scale, but it's just a question. I mean, it's gain staging. Yeah, the Atmos mixes, I think, prove the point. And my hope is that with more people listening to them and experimenting with them, they're going to hear that and they're going to realize that one of the things they love about Atmos is the extra dynamics. And maybe that will allow more artists and more labels to kind of feel like, okay, well, we could experiment with that in the stereo versions as well, and we could bring some of that cinematic kind of feel back to the stereo format, because it's absolutely possible there. You don't have the spatial elements, you don't have the height and the
right.
surround aspects, but we could be using all of that dynamics there and still get the sound for all of these genres. I guess you'd agree with that.
I totally agree with that. Absolutely. And I would say that has manifested itself in my own work. If I'm mixing in stereo, I think in a more dynamic way than I used to. We exist in this kind of post-limitation environment of consumer formats. We've gotten very used to a very loud presentation of our stereo music. And it's easy to get very comfortable with that because, we're naturally inclined to perceive louder as better. Or at least, it's the knee-jerk reaction of comparing things, that whichever version is louder is likely to be the one that we'll gravitate towards. I'm not saying all the time, but as a general rule, people tend to react that way. I don't think that the nature of the way we're consuming music necessarily needs to be limited by that, by the necessity of hitting a certain loudness target. And I think that freedom should offer us the opportunity to explore more dynamic experiences in any format of music consumption. And I'm cautiously optimistic that because Atmos so natively gives us that opportunity, that it will allow us as a community of creators to kind of explore that in every of our expressions, and I would love to see that happen.
No, absolutely. Completely agree. It's great that you're here. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I am curious to find out what kind of reaction you get from artists and labels when they hear the Atmos mixes. I have to ask, are you being put under pressure to make things louder, and how does that work out? But I'm guessing people really appreciate and love. Everybody I speak to in Atmos tells me that artists in particular love the sound when they get the chance to hear it.
The overwhelming experience that I have when putting artists and creators in front, in the room, in the right spot, hitting play is positive. People love it. They can explore things about their own compositions that, maybe had to be sacrificed in order for the greater good of the stereo experience. There's all these opportunities for like fidelity and intelligibility of complex arrangements. I did this War on Drugs record, and their compositional style often is layering tons of different voices that are doing a very similar musical or harmonic expression. And I'm like, great, I'll spread that out. And we can explore all of those different textures in a meaningful way while also getting the aggregate experience of the original composition. And when playing it back for the mix engineer and the artist himself, we had a ton of fun exploring those things. And remember, oh yeah, well, that's right, we doubled that on the Jupiter, and oh yeah, we did, and it was just like all of these cool things that get to kind of unfold in the Atmos playback environment, which is great. To your point about pressure for loudness. By and large, no, I'm not really under any pressure for that. I will say, however, it is something that is part of my workflow. I do pay attention to the feeling of the energy transfer that I'm getting from the stereo, and I will employ mix techniques to match those in different ways with my Atmos mix, with my stems, and with, just regular mixing prowess, right? Parallels, dynamic interchange, all of just kind of our regular techniques and some new techniques that are specific to the format. But, I've had conversations with mix engineers where they're like, yeah, but there's no mix bus. So like, I don't know how to get that thing. And it's like, I get you. And I didn't either. But then I figured out a way to do it in a compelling and different way. Like, is it the same? No, but the same isn't the job. The same is something different and new, So like, it's called engineering, right? Engineer your way into a solution, utilize all of the resources available to you, all of your experiences and your critical judgment. And you can create a mix that reads as a very loud and bombastic experience when it needs to, and intimate and open and spacious when not, and I think that's definitely part of the gig. It's like, yes, sure. It's easy to slap a compressor or a limiter on a mix bus at the end of the day. I mean, I don't mean to undermine that in and of itself is an incredible art form, but it's more complicated to achieve a similar thing in the way object-based mixing in Atmos works. And while that is a challenge, it's not impossible to deal with. We identify what it is about those interchanges that are important, and then figure out a way to create those and without compromising the expression that you're trying to get out of Atmos. Rock and roll is a very sensitive genre for this exact conversation, right? The relationship between the kick drum and the rhythm guitar is wildly important in any modern rock and roll presentation, whether it's alt rock or metal, doesn't matter. Like, this is rock and roll. And so, we have to go to great lengths to create that experience in Atmos while not curbing our ability to express what's important about Atmos, because you also don't want 20 speakers blasting crazy limited data, because that's just super fatiguing and it's a difficult, you get tired. Your brain gets tired. It shuts down. So many different parts of your brain are working when listening in Atmos or any immersive format compared to stereo, because it's engaging you in so many different vectors that it triggers all of these other parts of your brain, and therefore it can be fatiguing. So we need to be sensitive to that and explore ways in which we can find a nice, a happy medium where we got, great energy transfer and open, dynamic, compelling, immersive experience. While it's easy to be like, yes, we can be louder, we can be quieter, we can do all of this great stuff, there is a certain necessity to making sure that the feeling of the music matches what's so critical about the identity as it exists in stereo. While nobody's telling me make it loud, I'm making sure that I'm getting that perceived energy to where it's supposed to be, so that it feels loud, even if it's coming in at -18. And then my other, kind of flip side consumer facing argument to there is that, like, no matter what device you're using, it may only have one button or knob on it, and I guarantee you that is the volume. And sometimes you got to reach for it. You know what I mean? I'm like, I think sound check is a great implementation of an automated volume, because it's not a compressor. It's just turning things up and down. And I think that's great. I think that being aware of your environment and being aware of which experience will likely be better for you under those circumstances is also relevant, like for the same reason that, if you're watching a movie on a TV with speakers built into a TV, you might want to use a reduced dynamic range feature. If you're on a home theater system, you would then not want to use a reduced dynamic range feature because you've got the headroom and you've got a device that's capable of putting out that level of sensitivity, right? For those of us who are engaged in the experience, I think there's a wealth of opportunities to explore how to make it optimized for what we want and what we need. And so knowing that that's true when I'm in the studio, I just try and serve the art to the best of my ability.
Fantastic. Well, listen, congratulations. It's an amazing album. The Atmos version is amazing. I love it. Thanks again for taking the time to be with us today. We really appreciate that insight into how you work and the opportunities of the Atmos format. I'm looking forward to hearing what you do next.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. And thank you so much for the award. I'm very appreciative of it. I was very proud of that record. And so to be able to have a conversation about it is very satisfying for me. So thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Nick. Cheers.
Cool. All right, man.
So there you go. I hope that was interesting or useful. It was great to talk to Nick, get some insight into that. And I do encourage you to start experimenting, listening to some of the Atmos mixes, even in binaural, of these albums that are coming out, because they are so much more dynamic than the originals. And you really get the chance to hear the benefits of that, and also how it is possible to achieve the authentic sound of the material without having to crush everything up into a limiter. I actually recorded another interview on Dynamic Range Day this year with Justin Gray from Immersive Mastering, where again we talked about this whole topic and got really into even more in-depth nitty-gritty information about mixing in Atmos, the differences between the binaural and the speaker mixes, and how dynamics play into that. So we will leave a link to that in the show notes at themasteringshow.com if you would like to take a look at that as well. Thanks as always to John Tidy for editing and mixing the episode. Thanks to Kaylee Law for letting us use his music. And thanks for listening.